In the realm of the missing, I'd venture to say about half the calls I work on are just that. People who have vanished without a trace. The other half? Those are the pleas for help. You've got folks tumbling off cliffs, injuring themselves, suffering burns, and you wouldn't believe how often this happens, mostly with drunk teens, getting bitten or stung by wildlife. We're a tight-knit crew, armed with experienced trackers, adept at picking up the faintest signs of the lost. It's particularly disheartening when we come up empty, finding no trace of the person. Sometimes, though, the signs we do find lead to more questions than answers. Take the case of Michael Robertson, an elderly man who decided to take a hike on a well-traveled trail. His wife, Susan, reached out to us when he didn't return by the expected time. Apparently, Michael might have been prone to seizures, and Susan was worried he hadn't taken his medication, worsening his condition during the hike. Before you ask, I've no idea why he thought hiking alone was a good idea, or why she didn't accompany him. I don't dwell on these details. Someone's missing, and it's my job to find them. We set out in our standard search formation, and soon enough, one of our seasoned veterans spotted signs someone had strayed from the path. We regrouped and fanned out, following the veteran's lead. Then the radio crackled to life, urging us to converge on our veteran's location. Such commands usually mean the missing person is injured and needs a full team for evacuation. When we got back, the veteran was just standing there, head in hands. "What's going on?" I asked a buddy, and he gestured up into the branches of a nearby tree. I couldn't believe my eyes, but there it was, a walking stick, hanging about 30 feet off the ground. The small strap on its handle was wrapped around a branch, the stick just dangling there. It seemed impossible for someone to have thrown it that far. Plus, we saw no other sign he was still around. We called out for Michael, but it was clear he wasn't up in that tree. We were all scratching our heads in confusion. Despite further searching, and even bringing in search dogs, we found nothing. Michael's scent was lost well before this mysterious tree. Eventually, we had to call off the search. Other calls needed attending to, and we'd done all we could. Susan called daily for months, asking if we'd found her husband. With each call, hope faded from her voice. I don't know why, but this case sticks with me, perhaps due to the sheer improbability of it all. How did Michael's stick end up there? Was this some bizarre trophy from a perpetrator? We did everything to find him, but it felt like the universe was mocking us. We still talk about it from time to time. Child disappearances are the most heart-wrenching. No matter the circumstances, they're always horrifying, and the fear of finding them deceased is always present. Though rare, it does happen. David Paulides speaks volumes about children found by searchers in places they couldn't be. I've heard of these cases more than I've encountered them, but one I was directly involved in keeps me pondering. A mother and her 3 kids were picnicking near a small lake. The children, aged 6, 5, and about 3, were under her watchful eye. She insisted she never lost sight of them. Importantly, she saw no one else around. As they headed back to the parking lot, the lake being only a couple of miles from the forest and adjacent to a well-marked trail, her 5-year-old son vanished in the time it took her to glance away. She thought he'd stepped off the path to relieve himself and asked the remaining kids where he went. They said a big man with a scary face emerged from the woods, took the boy by the hand, and led him away. The children seemed unaffected by their brother's disappearance, but the mother described them as if they were under some drug-induced haze. Their consciousness clouded. Naturally, she panicked, searching frantically for her child. She screamed his name, and at one point thought she heard him respond. Realizing she couldn't blindly run into the forest with 2 kids in tow, she called the police, who promptly dispatched us. We scoured the area, covering miles, finding not a trace of the boy. The dogs couldn't pick up his scent. We found no clothes, no broken bushes, nothing to indicate his presence. The mother was initially a suspect, but it was clear she was devastated by the ordeal. We searched for weeks with numerous volunteers, but eventually, the search was officially called off, though volunteers persisted. Then, one day, a radio call announced a body was found, and we were to retrieve it. The volunteers described the location, and disbelief settled in. We assumed it had to be another child. We arrived about 15 miles from where he disappeared, and indeed, it was the boy we'd been searching for. I struggled to comprehend what had happened to him, but answers eluded me. A volunteer just happened to explore an area thought irrelevant by others. He approached the base of a steep, rocky incline and spotted something halfway up. Using binoculars, he identified it as the small body of a boy lodged in a crevice. Recognizing the color of the child's shirt from descriptions, he knew it was the missing boy and called us. It took nearly an hour to retrieve the body, and we were all in disbelief. Not only was the boy 15 miles from where he vanished, but the incline steepness, even with our climbing gear, was a challenge. A 5-year-old couldn't have managed it alone, I'm certain. What's more, there wasn't a scratch on him. His shoes were gone, yet his feet were unscathed and clean. Had an animal dragged him up there, the scene would have looked different. Plus, he'd died only a day or two before we found him, over a month after he went missing. The whole situation was incredibly strange, one of the oddest cases in my memory. Later, the medical examiner determined the boy had died from exposure, likely freezing to death in the cold of the night 2 days before we found him. There were no suspects, no answers. To this day, it remains one of the most baffling things I've ever witnessed. One of my first search operations as an intern involved a 4-year-old boy who had wandered away from his mother. This was one of those cases where we were confident we'd find the child since the dogs had picked up his scent, and we observed clear signs he was in the area. Eventually, we found him in a thicket of berry bushes about a mile from where he was last seen. The kid didn't even realize he'd gone that far. A veteran on our team brought him back. Much to my relief, since I'm not the best with kids, I find it hard to keep a conversation going with them. As my mentor and I headed back, she decided to take a detour to show me a hot spot where we often find missing persons. It's a natural descent next to a popular trail, and people usually head downhill since it's easier. This place was a few miles from us, and it took us about an hour to get there. As we walked through the area, with her pointing out spots where she'd found people, I spotted something in the distance. It was about 9 miles from the main parking area, though there were back roads one could take if they didn't want to trek that far. But we were on state-protected land, meaning no commercial or residential development was allowed here. The only things you'd typically see are a fire tower or a makeshift shelter built by homeless individuals. Yet what I saw had straight edges, and nature rarely creates anything with straight lines. I pointed it out, but my mentor said nothing. She just stopped and let me get closer to inspect. I was about 7 yards away when my hair stood on end. It was a staircase in the middle of the damn forest. Normally, this might be somewhat expected, but not here. It was an ordinary staircase with beige carpeting, about 10 steps high. But instead of being in a house, where it obviously belonged, it stood here, in the forest. Its sides weren't enclosed, and I could see the wood it was made from. It felt like a glitch in a video game, as if the house hadn't loaded properly, leaving only the staircase visible. I stood there, my brain working overtime to process what I was seeing. My mentor came up beside me, just standing there, looking at the staircase as if it were the least interesting thing in the world. I asked her what the hell it was doing here, and she just chuckled. "Get used to it, rookie. You'll see a lot of these." I started to approach it, but she grabbed my arm firmly. "I wouldn't do that," she said. Her tone was casual, but her grip was strong, and I just stood there, staring at her. "You'll see them all the time, but don't go near them. Don't touch them, don't climb them, just ignore them." I began to ask her about it, but something in her look told me it was better if I stopped asking questions. We moved on and didn't discuss the incident for the rest of my internship. She was right, though. I'd say about every 5th call I go on ends with me being near a staircase. Sometimes they're relatively close to the trail, maybe within 2 or 3 miles. Sometimes they're 30 or 50 miles out, literally in the middle of nowhere. I find them during the largest search operations or during training exercises. They're usually in good condition, but sometimes they seem like they've been standing in that spot for 100 years. They all look different, all various sizes. The largest I've ever seen looked like it was pulled straight out of a mansion from the early 20th century. It was at least 10 feet wide, with steps leading up about 16 or 17 feet. I've tried talking about them with colleagues, but they respond the same way my mentor did. It's normal. Don't worry about them. They're completely unremarkable, but don't get too close or climb them. When rookies ask me about it, I give them the same advice. I don't know what else to say. I really hope to get a straight answer someday, but so far, it hasn't happened. The next case is less terrifying and more sad. A young man disappeared late in the winter, when no one should venture far from the trails. We close many trails for the winter, but some remain open year-round unless they're completely buried under a damn heap of snow. We conducted a search operation, but with the snow depth reaching about 6.5 feet, it was a heavy snow year. We knew it was unlikely we'd find him until the spring thaw. Sure enough, as soon as the first major thaw began, a tourist reported finding a body not far from the main trail. We found him at the base of a tree in a pile of thawing snow. I immediately understood what had happened, and it scared the crap out of me. Those of you who ski, snowboard, or climb mountains probably guessed too. When snow falls, it's less dense under the branches of trees than in the open. This is often the case with snow under firs because their shape is like an umbrella. So you end up with a space around the base of the tree filled with a mix of needles, powdery snow, air, and branches. We call these wells, and they're not immediately obvious unless you know exactly what to look for. We post large warning signs in park tourist offices to highlight how dangerous these places can be, but every year, when there's a lot of snow, at least one person either doesn't read them or doesn't take the warning seriously, and we learn about it in the spring. The most likely scenario is that this young man was hiking and got tired, or maybe his leg cramped from walking through the deep snow. He went to sit at the base of a tree, not realizing it was one of these wells, and fell in. He got stuck with his legs up, and the surrounding snow collapsed around him. Unable to free himself, he suffocated. This is called snow immersion suffocation, and usually only happens in really deep snow. But if you're stuck in an awkward position, like this guy, even 6.5 feet of snow is enough to kill you. What scared me the most is that he must have struggled for his life. Hanging upside down in the biting cold, he didn't die right away. The snow could have formed a dense, heavy pile on top of him, making escape impossible. When it became hard to breathe, he definitely knew what was happening. I can't even imagine what he thought in his last moments. Many of my friends, who rarely go out on search operations, want to know if I've ever seen the goat man while on calls. Fortunately, or unfortunately, I've never encountered him. I think the closest was that encounter with the black-eyed thing. But there was one call where something similar happened to me, though I'm not sure exactly. We got a report that an elderly woman had fainted on one of the trails and needed assistance to get back. We headed out to where she and her husband were. The husband was beside himself. He ran up to us like he was out for a morning jog, explaining he was not far off the trail, looking around when his wife started screaming behind him. He ran back to her, and at that moment she fainted. We put her on a stretcher, and when we got back to the information center, she came to and began screaming again. I tried to calm her down and asked what happened. I don't remember her exact words, but it was something along these lines. She was waiting for her husband when she heard a very strange sound. She said it sounded like a cat, but was somehow off and she couldn't figure out why. She moved forward a bit to try and hear the sound better, and it seemed to start moving towards her. She said the closer the sound got, the harder it was to understand what was wrong with it. Finally, she realized what was off about the sound. I remember the next part because it was so strange. I don't think I could forget it even if I wanted to. It wasn't a cat, it was a man saying meow over and over again, just meow, meow, meow. But it couldn't have been a person because I've never heard a human voice sound so hollow. I thought my hearing aid had fallen out, but it hadn't. I adjusted it, and the sound still sounded hollow. It was terrifying, He was getting closer, but I couldn't see him. And the closer he got, the more scared I became. The last thing I remember is a figure emerging from the trees. I probably fainted then. After hearing her story, I was slightly puzzled as to why some guy would be in the damn forest saying meow meow to people. So, as soon as we descended from the mountain, I told my supervisor I'd go back and search the area to see if I could find anything. He gave his permission, I grabbed a radio, and returned to where she had fainted. I saw no one and continued walking about a mile from that spot. I went off the trail to see if I could figure out where exactly the woman encountered this. By then, the sun was almost down, and I had no desire to wander alone at night, so I just decided to make a mental note to check again tomorrow. But as I was heading back, I began to hear something in the distance. I stopped and shouted, "Anyone nearby, identify yourself." The sound didn't get closer or louder, but it sounded exactly like someone repeating meow meow in a strange monotone way. As comical as it sounds, it was like that guy with the voice box from South Park, Ned. I went off the trail in the direction I thought the sound was coming from, but it didn't get any closer. It seemed like the sound was coming from all around at once. Eventually it just stopped, and I headed back to the center. I never received any reports about the case, and although I returned to that area of the park, I never heard the sound again. I suppose it could have been some dumb guy messing with people, but I must admit, it was weird.